The day my sister handed me a garbage bag with my own clothes inside it, I understood something I had never let myself believe. Blood does not always mean loyalty. I was standing in the driveway of the house I grew up in. The house where my mother had died only 3 weeks earlier. And Diane was telling me, in a voice as calm as if she were discussing the weather, that I no longer had a place there. "This isn't your home anymore, Rachel," she said. "It never really was." I want you to imagine that moment. The smell of your mother's kitchen still lingering in the walls. Her sweater still hanging by the door, because none of us had the strength to move it. And your own sister, the person you shared a childhood with, telling you to leave, like you were a stranger who had overstayed a welcome. That was the beginning of the darkest year of my life. But it was also, though I did not know it yet, the beginning of something else. Something that would eventually bring my sister to her knees, begging me for the one thing she thought she would never need from me again: forgiveness. My name is Rachel Hartman, and before I tell you what happened after that day in the driveway, I need you to understand who we were before everything fell apart. If this story moves you even a little, please hit subscribe, because there is a lot more to tell, and you will not want to miss where this goes. I was the younger daughter. Diane was older by 4 years, and from the time we were children, she had a way of making herself the center of every room. Our mother, Eleanor, ran a small bakery in our town, a place called Hartman's, which had been passed down from our grandmother. It smelled like cinnamon and fresh bread every single morning, and some of my earliest memories are of standing on a wooden stool, flour on my hands, watching my mother shape dough with a patience I never understood until I was older. Diane wanted nothing to do with the bakery when we were young. She wanted bigger things, she used to say. She went off to study business in the city, married a man named Mark who worked in finance, and for years she visited our small town only on holidays, usually with a look on her face that told you she believed she had outgrown us. I was the one who stayed. I worked beside my mother for over a decade, learning every recipe, every supplier, every regular customer's name and their order. I loved that bakery the way you love a person. It was not just a job. It was my whole life. When my mother got sick, everything changed. It started slowly, fatigue she blamed on age, and then it did not stop. The diagnosis was pancreatic cancer, and within 8 months she was gone. I was the one who sat with her through chemotherapy. I was the one who drove her to appointments, who held the bucket when the medication made her sick, who read to her at night when the pain kept her from sleeping. Diane visited twice during those 8 months. Both times, she stayed less than a day. I do not say this to make myself sound like a saint. I say it because it matters for what comes later. Because on the day of the funeral, standing in that same house filled with casseroles from neighbors and flowers that were already beginning to wilt, Diane stood up in front of everyone and said something that still echoes in my mind. She said that our mother had told her privately that she wanted Diane to take over everything. The house, the bakery, the savings, all of it. I remember the silence in that room. I remember looking at the faces of people who had known our family for 30 years, watching them try to decide whether to believe her. I remember my own voice, shaking, asking her where this had ever been written down, and Diane's calm reply that our mother trusted her enough not to need paperwork. 3 weeks later came the will reading, and that is when the real blow landed. The lawyer, a man named Gerald Whitfield, who had worked with our family for years, read a document that gave nearly everything to Diane. The house, the bakery, the bank accounts. I received a small envelope of photographs and a letter that Gerald said had been added later, one that thanked me vaguely for my help and wished me well in whatever I chose to do next. It felt like a stranger had written it. It did not sound like my mother at all. I sat in that lawyer's office feeling like the floor had opened beneath me. 10 years of my life, poured into that bakery, into caring for that house, into caring for our mother, and I walked away with nothing but an envelope of old photographs. Diane did not even wait a respectful amount of time before she started making changes. She fired 2 employees who had worked at Hartman's for over 15 years. She rebranded the bakery with a new sign, a new logo, calling it Diane's Artisan Table, as if the place had not existed for 40 years before she ever set foot behind the counter, and then came the day with the garbage bag. She said she needed the guest room for storage. She said Mark's business was expanding, and they needed the house to entertain clients. She said a lot of things, but none of them were the truth. The truth was simpler and colder. She wanted me gone because as long as I was there, I was a living reminder that the bakery had never truly been hers to take. I moved in with my friend Carla, who had a spare room above her garage. I remember lying awake that first night, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of my mother's final months, searching for some clue, some sign that she truly meant to leave me with. Nothing. I could not find one. Something in my gut told me the will I had heard read out loud was not the whole story, but I had no proof, no lawyer of my own, and no strength left to fight. So I did what people do when the world knocks them down. I got up anyway. Carla found me in the kitchen at 3 in the morning that first week, sitting on the floor with my back against the refrigerator, staring at nothing. She did not ask what was wrong. She already knew. She just sat down next to me, handed me a mug of tea I never drank, and stayed there until the sun came up. I will never forget that kindness, especially because it came from someone who was not even blood. While the person who was supposed to be my family had just thrown my clothes into a trash bag like I was nothing to her at all. The hardest part was not the money, though the money mattered. The hardest part was the silence from people I thought would defend me. Old family friends, people who had eaten dinner at our table 100 times, suddenly stopped calling. A few reached out privately to say they believed me, but none of them were willing to say it publicly. Not while Diane was hosting dinner parties and posting photographs of her new chapter online. I understood, in a painful way, that grief makes people cowardly. Nobody wants to choose a side in a family war, even when one side is clearly telling the truth. I remember calling my mother's old friend, a woman named Judith, who had known us since we were babies, just to hear a familiar voice. Judith listened quietly while I explained everything. And then she said something I have never forgotten. Your mother was proud of you, Rachel. Whatever that paper says, that will never be the truth. I hung up the phone and cried harder than I had at the funeral itself. Because for the first time, someone outside of my own head had said out loud what I desperately needed to hear. I took a job at a diner 3 towns over, waiting tables for tips that barely covered rent. It was humbling in a way I cannot fully describe. I had spent a decade perfecting sourdough starters and wedding cake designs, and now I was refilling coffee cups for truckers at 5 in the morning. Some nights I would go into the walk-in cooler just to have 30 seconds alone, lean my forehead against the cold metal shelving, and remind myself that this was temporary, even when it did not feel temporary at all. There were nights I genuinely wondered if I had made the wrong choice by not fighting harder. I would replay the funeral in my head, wondering if I should have stood up right then and there and called Diane a liar in front of everyone. But something always stopped me. A part of me still believed that a person who builds their life on lies eventually has to live inside the wreckage of those lies. I did not know yet how true that would become, but something happened during those months that I did not expect. People started asking about my old cinnamon rolls. Word had traveled that Eleanor Hartman's daughter, the one who actually did the baking, was working nearby. Small orders started coming in. A birthday cake. Here. A dozen rolls for a church event. There. An older woman named Mrs. Petricus, who had bought bread from our family for 30 years, tracked down my number through a mutual friend just to place an order for her granddaughter's baptism. When she picked it up, she held my hands in hers and said, "This tastes like your mother again. I've missed this." I had to excuse myself to the back room so she would not see me cry. I started baking out of Carla's kitchen at night, exhausted, flour under my fingernails again. But for the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. I would work my diner shift until 3 in the afternoon, sleep for 2 hours, and then bake until midnight, filling orders one at a time, building something slowly, quietly, without any of the noise or announcements that Diane seemed to need for everything she did. Meanwhile, back in town, Diane's version of Hartman's Bakery was struggling in ways she never expected. She had raised prices to fund renovations. She had cut corners on ingredients to save money, not understanding that our mother's recipes depended on quality, not shortcuts. Longtime customers noticed immediately. The bread that used to sell out by 9 in the morning now sat on the shelves until closing. Diane, who had never actually learned to bake, began hiring and firing staff every few months, always blaming someone else for the decline. She posted constantly on social media about her brand vision, while quietly falling behind on payments to suppliers who had trusted our family for decades. I heard all of this secondhand. Through mutual friends, through Carla, through the occasional customer who mentioned it while picking up an order from me. One former employee of Diane's, a young man named Tyler, who had worked at Hartman's since he was 17, quit after Diane accused him of stealing from the register to cover a shortfall that was actually caused by her own mismanagement. He told me later, over coffee, that morale in that building had turned toxic within months. "She talks about your mom's legacy in every interview," he said, "but she never once asked any of us how your mom actually did things. She just wanted the name without the work." Part of me, I will admit, felt a small flicker of satisfaction hearing these stories. Not pride, exactly. Something more complicated. A quiet sense that maybe the universe kept better records than any lawyer's office. But another part of me felt an old, stubborn sadness. Because that bakery had been my mother's life's work, and watching it fall apart in careless hands felt like watching a second death. Slower and quieter than the first, but the real turning point came almost a year later, in a moment so small, I almost missed it. I was going through a box of my mother's old cookbooks, ones Diane had let me take, since she considered them not valuable enough to keep. Tucked inside the back cover of my mother's favorite recipe book, the one with her handwriting scattered in the margins, I found a folded envelope. My hands were shaking before I even opened it. Inside was a letter, dated only 4 months before she passed, and it was unmistakably her handwriting. In that letter, my mother wrote that she was frightened. She wrote that Diane had been pressuring her for months to sign new paperwork, papers she did not fully understand, papers she felt too tired and too sick to argue about. She wrote that she loved us both, but that she wanted the bakery and the house to be shared equally between her daughters, exactly the way it had always been intended. And most importantly, she wrote the name and phone number of another lawyer, someone outside of Gerald Whitfield's office, a man she had contacted quietly on her own, asking him to hold a separate, updated document safe until the time was right. I sat on the floor of Carla's spare room and cried in a way I had not allowed myself to cry since the funeral. Not just from grief, but from the sheer weight of finally understanding that I had not imagined it. My mother had not abandoned me. She had been afraid, sick, and manipulated in her final months, and she had tried, in the only way she still had strength for, to protect me. Called the number the next morning with trembling hands, half expecting to reach a disconnected line, half afraid of what I would hear if someone actually answered. The lawyer, a woman named Patricia Alvarez, remembered my mother immediately, and her voice softened the moment I said my name. "I wondered if I would ever hear from you," she said. "Your mother talked about you often. She was worried, Rachel. She was worried about what would happen to you." Patricia told me that Eleanor Hartman had come to her privately, frightened and unwell, asking her to draft an updated will splitting the estate equally between her 2 daughters, along with a signed statement describing the pressure she had felt from Diane regarding the earlier documents. My mother had been so afraid of confrontation, so weakened by chemotherapy, that she had not wanted anyone to know she had gone behind Gerald Whitfield's back. She told Patricia she was terrified Diane would find out and cut off contact entirely before she passed. Patricia had been waiting, per my mother's instructions, for someone to come forward before releasing it. Unsure if anyone ever would, I asked Patricia why my mother had not simply told me directly. Why she had left it buried in a cookbook instead of handing it to me herself. Patricia was quiet for a moment before answering. "Sometimes people who are dying are more afraid of causing conflict than they are of leaving things unresolved," she said. "I think she hoped you would find it when you were ready, and that by then, the truth would matter more than the timing." What followed was not simple. Legal matters rarely are. Patricia guided me through months of paperwork, depositions, and difficult conversations I never imagined I would have to have. With her help, and with the letter as evidence of my mother's true intentions, the original will was formally challenged. Gerald Whitfield, when confronted with the timeline and the newer document, admitted under pressure that Diane had come to him urging a simplified version of the will be filed quickly, while our mother was heavily medicated and easily confused. He claimed he believed at the time that he was honoring Eleanor's wishes, but records showed he had never once spoken with her alone to confirm it. It was not outright forgery in the criminal sense, but it was manipulation serious enough that the courts agreed to revisit the entire estate. During the proceedings, I learned details that made my stomach turn. Text messages between Diane and Gerald's office, recovered during discovery, showed Diane pushing for the paperwork to be finalized within days of our mother's declining health, using language like, "before things get complicated," and "she won't remember signing it anyway." Reading those messages in Patricia's office, I felt something inside me finally settle. I was not imagining things. I had not been paranoid or bitter. I had simply been right all along, and now, for the first time, there was proof. While all of this unfolded quietly behind closed doors, Diane's life above the surface was already crumbling in ways money and pride could not fix. The bakery, drowning in debt from renovations no one asked for, finally closed its doors permanently. She had taken out loans against the building itself, using the house as collateral, without fully understanding, or perhaps not caring, what that meant. Mark, her husband, whose business had always seemed so impressive from the outside, had in fact been struggling for years, and it came out that he had been having an affair with a coworker for over a year, someone Diane had once called a friend. Their marriage ended not long after the bakery did. I did not seek any of this out. I did not celebrate it in the way you might imagine someone celebrating an enemy's downfall. Watching my sister lose everything did not feel like victory. It felt like watching a slow-motion collapse of something that should never have been built on lies in the first place. The day Diane finally called me, her voice sounded nothing like the woman who had handed me a garbage bag 2 years earlier. It was quiet, cracked, almost unrecognizable. She asked if we could meet. I agreed, mostly out of curiosity, and partly, if I am honest, because some small part of me still hoped for the sister I remembered from childhood. The one who used to braid my hair before school. We met at a small coffee shop, neutral ground. She looked tired in a way makeup could not hide. She told me the house was being foreclosed on. She told me she had nowhere to go. And then, after a long, uncomfortable silence, she asked if I could help her, financially, or by letting her stay with me temporarily. I want to tell you I felt nothing but anger in that moment. But the truth is more complicated than that. I felt grief for the family we used to be. I felt anger for everything she had taken and everything she had said about me at our mother's funeral. And underneath all of it, I felt something my mother would have wanted me to feel, a stubborn, inconvenient thread of compassion. I told her the truth. I told her about the letter. I told her that Patricia Alvarez already had documentation proving what our mother truly wanted, and that the legal process to divide the estate fairly, the way it always should have been, was already underway. I watched the color drain from her face as she realized I had known the truth for months and had chosen, quietly, to let justice take its course instead of confronting her the way she had once confronted me in front of an entire room of mourners. "You knew," she whispered. "And you didn't say anything?" "I didn't need to," I said. "You built this yourself, Diane. Every part of it." I did not turn her away completely. I am not built that way, and honestly, I do not think our mother would have wanted me to become someone who slams doors the way Diane once did to me. I told her that once the estate was settled, her rightful half, smaller now, after debts were paid, but still hers, would be available to help her start over, on her own, away from me. I told her I would not be her safety net for choices she made without me, but I also would not be the reason she had nothing left at all. The court eventually ruled in favor of the updated will. The proceeds from the sale of what remained of the property were split, fairly this time, the way Eleanor Hartman had always intended. I used my portion, along with the small business I had already built from Carla's kitchen, to open a modest bakery of my own in a quiet corner of downtown, one I named simply Eleanor's, after the woman who taught me everything I know about flour, patience, and quiet strength. It is not large. It does not have a fancy logo or a social media strategy. But every morning, the smell of cinnamon and fresh bread fills the street outside. Just like it did when I was a little girl standing on a wooden stool. Diane and I are not close now. We speak occasionally, mostly logistics, mostly short conversations that carry the weight of everything unsaid between us. But I no longer carry the same anger I once did. I learned something in that year of losing everything and slowly building it back with my own two hands. Karma does not always arrive with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it arrives quietly, through a folded letter hidden in the back of an old cookbook, waiting patiently for the right person to find it. If there is one thing I want you to take from my story, it is this. Truth has a way of surfacing, even when it is buried under lies, under fear, under years of silence. You do not have to fight loudly for justice. Sometimes you only have to stay honest, stay patient, and trust that the people who truly loved you left more behind than what was written down on paper. If this story moved you, if it made you think of your own family, your own battles, your own quiet victories, I would love to hear about it. Tell me in the comments what you would have done in my place. And if you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, share this video with someone who needs a reminder that karma always finds its way home. Thank you for listening, and I will see you in the next story.